Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Paul's Garden Gab. We're a wee bit late today, which I apologise for, but we're trying something new today. So we've never done one of these from my garden with a guest who is with us virtually. So it's been a kind of couple of firsts this week with the Garden Gab. So it's the first week we have been out on location. We were with Natalie on Wednesday in her garden in Neilston, chatting about education and what it's like homeschooling her kids, which was really interesting. So it was the first time I ventured out of my own garden. I'm back in my garden today, and I'm talking to Ian Murray. I'm delighted that Ian's been able to join us. Very, very busy man, but a good friend of mine. In fact, the last time I think we saw each other, Ian, you had come to visit me in East Wren, and we were
I did.
meeting various people as part of your kind of your campaign at that point to be deputy leader of the Labour Party. That seems like a long time ago, I must say, because so much has happened since then. But for anyone who doesn't know Ian, Ian is the Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South, and he's also the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, fairly newly appointed in Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet. So, how are things with you, Ian? How's life been in these past kind of 12 weeks or so? It's all been a bit up in the air.
Well, it's been a bit up in the air, and you're right. When I travelled to see you during the deputy leadership campaign, I think it was only maybe 5 months ago, and it feels like 20 years. So a lot's changed. Civilization has almost ended in the interim process. But look, it's been tough for a lot of people, hasn't it? But for MPs, it's been probably the busiest period that I've ever had. And quite rightly so. The number of amounts of correspondence we're getting, and you'll see this as well, Paul, as a senior councillor in your patch, that people are concerned, they've got lots of issues, they've got lots of questions, and the volumes of correspondence has been off the scale. So it's been keeping myself and my team incredibly busy in terms of what's going on in the country and also in the patch.
Yeah, because amazing. I mean, you are famed as being a really hard-working constituency MP in Edinburgh, and you've got an office that has a work rate I don't think I've ever seen. So you'll have been inundated, I think, with both that kind of people inquiring about health advice and the government response, but also just that community stuff, I guess, of people kind of going above and beyond.
Yeah, and despite the coronavirus swamping everything at the moment, life still goes on. So it's not just all that local stuff, but we've received an unprecedented amount of correspondence on the Black Lives Matters issue. We've got the stuff around cladding, the Grenfell anniversary. We've got pay for NHS and care workers, the merger of DFID and FCO, the Gender Recognition Act, the immigration bills going through the House of Commons, the trade bills going through the House of Commons, the agricultural bills going through. And every single time anything happens on that, we will get thousands of pieces of correspondence on it. So everything from horse tethering to EDMs, about ivory sales, all the way through to big issues around Black Lives Matters and coronavirus. Everyone is emailing about all sorts of stuff at the moment. So it's incredibly busy, but it's great that people are really engaged. I just hope the lockdown eases so we can get people away from their computers as quickly as possible, back to work.
Absolutely, because we've become so used to this sort of way of living, of just chatting on Zoom, and obviously all of our work lives have changed as well. But I mean, I've been finding here in my community in East Hampshire that people have really wanted to help, and there's a great community spirit. And are you seeing that in Edinburgh as well? Are you seeing people kind of coming together, church groups, community groups, volunteers, that sort of really good reaction?
Yeah, I mean, it's been astonishing. Right at the very start, my local MSP, Daniel Johnson, and myself did a community call with a lot of community leaders, and we were all really concerned about how everyone was going to collectively respond to this, and the response has just been astonishing. Church groups have been right in the heart of their communities, as they always are actually, but this particular crisis has really shone a light on the kind of community work that our church groups do, our residents associations, anyone who's got any connection with the community has been putting infrastructure in place to help. For example, I'll give you two quick examples. We've got the Grange Association that looks after one of the leafiest parts of the constituency, mainly on planning matters and on preserving the conservation status issues. They asked for their membership to volunteer to help others. They got 350 members, and I've now got too many members and volunteers to help, and they've got people to help, which has just been fantastic. And then there's the Goodtrees Neighbourhood Centre in Morden, which is one of the most deprived parts of my constituency. The young people and the staff there have just come together. They've delivered 30,000 meals. They've been taking food parcels to people, electricity cards, delivering toys to needy families. It's just been utterly remarkable, and I just wish I could get some kind of official award to give out, because the way the community spirits come together, the silver lining of all this, Paul, is if we can harness that and extend it and continue it post-crisis, I think our communities will be much stronger for it.
You know, absolutely. I've been talking to a number of people who have been volunteers in the community, who are parents, and everything that they say at the end of these conversations is that they want to just bottle what they've experienced and try and keep that going. Because if we take something away from this, and a lot of people are talking about building back better, that's the kind of the buzzword, I guess. But how do we do that in our communities? And I think it's about, as you say, harnessing the fact that people have looked in on their neighbours perhaps for the first time, or the street has come together in a way that it hasn't before. So definitely need to keep that up, and it's good to hear that that's happening across the country, certainly in your patch as well. I suppose you've got an interesting life at the best of times, given that obviously you represent your constituency in London in the UK Parliament. But what's it been like there? I mean, I suppose for most folk who are maybe joining us here on the Garden Gab, they've just seen some of the pictures of Parliament, that hybrid model, or maybe the kind of controversy around how MPs are voting, that those sort of airport queues. It seems to have been a bit of confusion reigning down there. What's it been like for you, Ian?
Well, I mean, I've not really been in Parliament very much, but in the times that I have been there, I've been very impressed, because the first time I was in there, we had the full virtual Parliament with also remote voting. And I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that for the first time in probably 600 years, Westminster was being a beacon in the world for what you could do in terms of a virtual Parliament and remote voting. I mean, it was certainly ahead of all the other nations in the UK of what it was doing. And it was fantastic because we were able to engage from our kitchen tables, we were able to vote while we were doing our daily exercise, we were able to question ministers. It seemed, from a public perspective, because I watched a little bit of it as well on BBC Parliament, that from a viewer and from a member of the public, it seemed to be working relatively well in terms of engagement. Of course, it's not the same as being there in person. But then you had this ludicrous decision to bring everyone back. I'm not quite sure what they were trying to prove, because I can understand when you're saying, like, if we're asking frontline workers and pupils to go back to school, et cetera, then Parliament should lead by example. But as leading by example should have been, if you can work at home, you should work at home, and let's not cram 650 people from every single place in the United Kingdom to potentially contract coronavirus and then go home and spread it. So it was a ludicrous decision that I've no idea why it was taken. There was no reason for it. We actually are back to the virtual Parliament with remote voting, because people, if they've got a reason for not being at Parliament, can do that, and actually pretty tenuous reasons if you can't be there as well. So we're back to that, and the biggest disappointment is there's only 50 people allowed into the House of Commons chamber, 25 on each side. So you're not getting the kind of debate and attention to detail that the government used as an excuse to bring it back in any case. So a bit of an own goal, when in actual fact the benefits of being a virtual and remote voting was working really, really well.
Absolutely. And just what you said there, Ian, about that scrutiny, I mean, that's needed more now than ever. The decisions that have been taken by both governments. Obviously in Scotland we have the UK government and the Scottish government, making decisions that affect our lives, that have affected how we are suppressing the virus, but also obviously how we begin to recover and come out of lockdown measures. So you've been doing your bit obviously as Shadow Secretary of State in terms of just scrutinising the government's approach, both at Westminster and at Holyrood. And what's your kind of sense of where we are and how things have been going in terms of the response of the government?
Well, I mean, Keir Starmer was very clear at the start, and we've all emphasised this all the way through this, that we wanted to be a constructive government, a constructive opposition to government, because we're going through a global pandemic. It's something the whole country is suffering from, and therefore politicians and politics should come together and try and do what's in the best interests of the country. But that can only go so far. I mean, it takes two to tango, and both governments have been very resistant to trying to find a way of working. If they can't work together as governments, how on earth can we work together across party lines? And we've tried our very best to put forward constructive criticism, but also constructive solutions, and partly that has worked. So, Keir Starmer's had three great successes now at changing government policy, and with a government with a majority of 80, to do that in their first few months is quite a significant step forward. Of course, the free school meals with Marcus Rashford, it's great to be working with other people on these things. The visas for NHS workers and the death and benefits stuff as well, all brought about by trying to be constructive as well as scrutinising. But the biggest frustration is that until both governments can be transparent with the evidence of that's driving their decisions, then we can't really scrutinise their decisions. And then why they're not able to work together is based on the fact that they're basing that on the fact that they've got the evidence and scientific evidence to make different decisions, but they're not telling us what that is. And the biggest frustration is we can't have the four nations working together. And I can see why there might be regional and national differences, because you've got different infection rates and death rates and things. That's a perfectly legitimate thing, but we don't know why they're making those decisions. And it's not really geography in terms of national geography, it's much more micro-regional than that. It's ludicrous that, up until the rules changed yesterday, 8 people could meet in Scotland from 2 households, and it was only 6 in England. It was 8 in Wales. I don't know how many it was in Northern Ireland. How the 4 governments couldn't have come together and said 7 or 8 or 6 or 10 is just really petty. And some of that confusion could have been removed pretty easily.
And I think clarity for people on what they can and can't do kind of cross-border as well. I was talking to somebody during the week who has a granny in Carlisle, and there was a kind of conversation there about, can I go and see my granny in Carlisle? Can I not? How the 5 mile advisory radius, things like that. People, I think, feeling a bit confused, because obviously we all have ties on either side of the border. So I think you're right. I think maybe just trying to find that solution that works, for both. And I think you'll probably have seen this in Edinburgh as well, but the partnership between local councils and particularly the Scottish Government has been challenging at points, because local councils are delivering on the ground, in terms of the provision of shielding packages, phone calls to people who are shielding, free school meals, provision of hubs for education. We've seen a debate in the last week or so about trying to get more kids back to school in a really constructive way and a safe way. But we are struggling because we just don't have the resource, and we don't always have clear guidance from the Scottish Government. And I think that's been a big challenge. And I don't know if you've seen that in Edinburgh as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The education one that we're seeing that this is topical at this very moment in time is key to that. And I think it feeds into a lot of issues that have happened. What the Scottish Government have done is they've fronted up this coronavirus crisis. Nicola Sturgeon has been almost the single and sole voice of this coronavirus crisis, but then they've devolved the responsibility and the accountability to councils without giving them either A, clear guidance, B, actual clear legal rules, and C, any money. And you mentioned the free school meals, the education issues, the shielding, etc., which was a real problem in the early days. I think shielding's starting to resolve itself now. I think now that people have stopped hoarding toilet rolls, there are slots and things for people to have delivery. So I think that's resolving itself. But even things like the business support, what happened there, of course, the Scottish Government took the resources from the UK government. They didn't then pass all of those resources on under the rules. They then handed the administration rightly to councils because they deal with non-domestic rates. And then the councils were getting it in the ear for not delivering what the Scottish Government was saying they couldn't deliver. So the blame was then landing on councils. It was then coming to us as elected members, and we were trying to resolve it. So I think all of this could have been managed an awful lot better. And I think if the Scottish Government are going to front this and be the face of it, then they have to take the responsibility and the accountability as well, rather than just passing that on to other people.
Absolutely. And as you said at the start, we want to be constructive and we want to have that partnership approach, but we can't do that if there's not a reciprocal, so it's got to be a two-way street. Absolutely. Exactly. So if you're just joining us, hello, you're joining the Garden Gab. I am in my garden here. It's nice and dry and sunny in Neilston, and I'm joined by Ian Murray, Member of Parliament for Edinburgh South and Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland. And we were just chatting about coronavirus, the impact of lockdown, what our communities have been doing in response. Something I'm really interested about, Ian, and something that you have been very involved in is just the economic impact of COVID-19 and obviously of lockdown. We're already beginning to see real challenges, I think, in terms of people's jobs and livelihoods. Here in Renfrewshire, more widely, we've got a big issue around Rolls-Royce
Mm-hmm.
and the withdrawal of jobs at the Inchinnan plant. I know many people locally here in my community work for Rolls-Royce and are very concerned about the redundancy measures. In Edinburgh, obviously the withdrawal of things like the Fringe and the kind of festival season is going to have a massive economic impact on our hospitality sector and arts and culture. So, what's your kind of sense of, firstly, what we need to push the government, I think, to take more action, both governments, on these issues, but also what should our response be longer term to the economic challenges?
Well, I think what COVID has shown is the overarching fragility of our economy generally. And maybe the lack of diversification in our economy, particularly the Scottish economy. And, there has been, the Andrew Wilson, who wrote the SNP's Growth Commission, the Blueprint for Independence, said yesterday that we've got the worst economy in the world, developed economy in the world at this moment in time. And I think that's something that isn't a political point. It should just concern us all.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing we've got to do post-COVID is to... There's a wider global view of the diversification of the economy. Is it too reliant on too few sectors? Probably is. Do we have a big gap in our economy of those medium-sized businesses? We've got lots of small businesses. We've got quite a few very large businesses, but we've got nothing in between. And is there a problem in terms of government policy or in terms of the way our economy works of taking some of those startups and small businesses and turning them into medium-sized businesses? I suspect the reason we do have a dearth of those medium-sized businesses is because by the time a Scottish company gets there, it's probably been sold or moved on or broken up or it's gone into some other form. And I think that's one way to look at it. But the key thing, I think, post-COVID, and you talk about Rolls-Royce there, is we should all fight these job losses for as much as we can. But let's set aside the fact that that's not possible. You have to make sure you don't lose those skills and don't lose those units. Because when they're gone, they're gone. But if you can at least find a way of preserving what's there, it can be built back up again. It's very difficult to restart something that's disappeared completely, but it's very easy to restart and build it up if it's still there. And I think the Scottish Government might have to intervene on some of these major industries like the Rolls-Royce plant to say, do not close, because when the economy turns around, and hopefully it'll turn around quickly, it might take a bit longer than we think, but it might turn around quickly. And if your plant's still there and there's still skills in the community, it's much easier to re-employ than it is for the plants to be locked and then to re-employ elsewhere.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Inchinnan plant means so much to the community in terms of the jobs, but it's the wider supply chains, also the wider work that's done in terms of vocational training for young people. I was just before lockdown, we had a seminar with Strathclyde Uni and Rolls-Royce about the work that they do for kind of foundation apprenticeships. And so many young people, go through their paces at Rolls-Royce and learn the skills within that industry and the skills for the future. And as you say, if we lose the plant, we lose that opportunity and those skills.
And that's where government can step in, Paul, because any government support, I mean, it's difficult to condition government support that makes so that it doesn't make it difficult to even achieve, but there should be a jobs guarantee for young people that's attached to government support. It's about keeping all those avenues open and say, we will support you, but you need to give us something back.
Absolutely. And for your background before you were a member of Parliament was obviously in the kind of hospitality sector and the pub trade, and I talked to you a bit there about the festival and all that sort of stuff. I mean, in the last few days, we've heard that obviously it's going to be a slow process to getting back to us being able to go out and have a pint and stuff like that. What about the impact on that sector? Because that's obviously a sector that has often relied on, not very good terms and conditions a lot of the time for workers and quite insecure work. So how do we support that sector really to get back on its feet and to support people?
Well, I suppose there's a number of elements to answer that question, but the first one's quite a big element. I mean, the labour movement in particular has talked for a long time now, probably the last decade, about insecure work, about 0 hours contracts, about sectors that are poorly paid and poorly careered. And this crisis has maybe just put all of that into the public consciousness now. So people are much more aware of the insecurity of work, and that's some of the sectors. But I think in terms of on top of all of that, we have to address quite clearly that some sectors are going to take a long time to recover. Now, the biggest problem for the hospitality and tourism sector is very different from some other sectors, whereby if lockdown finished completely tomorrow, what is the tail it's going to take? Well, how long is the tail to ensure that these businesses can get back to some kind of normality? I suspect that tail might be incredibly long. And therefore, government support has to be put in place to make sure that they can survive until that tail gets to somewhere like some kind of normality. And that's the biggest concern we're getting from particularly the hospitality and tourism industries at the moment. And that's why I think the furlough scheme has to move from a generalised geographical furlough scheme across the whole of the UK to a sectorial furlough scheme that says to individual sectors, we know the pub sector and the hospitality trade and the tourism industries are going to be so severely hit into the medium term that we'll continue to support the jobs in those businesses across that term until we can get to some kind of normality. Otherwise, you will allow pubs, if you allow pubs to reopen tomorrow, they're not going to, with social distancing in place, they're not going to be able to be viable. And therefore you can't remove all the support. Otherwise you undo all the work that's been done over the last few months to keep them viable and to keep them in place till normality returns. So really difficult. And that's why I think the Scottish economy is going to be so badly hit, because of the disproportionate impact of tourism and the hospitality sector on the Scottish economy.
If you're just joining us on Paul's Garden Gab, we're with Ian Murray, Member of Parliament and Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, just chatting about COVID-19 and the impact. We're talking about the economy just now. And I suppose, Ian, you kind of entered Parliament for the first time in the wake of the financial crash, and we entered that recession that people will remember. And what kind of lessons have you learned, I guess, from that experience that are going to be relevant moving forward into the economy of the future coming out of this crisis?
Oh, well, I mean, the two big lessons that I hope all governments have learned is that government intervention in these kinds of crises is completely positive and something that's completely necessary. And the second thing is the partnership between business, workers, unions and government is completely critical to get things back up and running again. And I think that kind of government intervention, the penny's probably dropped from governments at the moment that austerity was never the way to go. Government should have been using their significant buying power, their significant procurement and their significant ability to borrow at very cheap rates to invest in the economy, to get the supply moving so that people's livelihoods and jobs could be protected. Now, I hope that's where the government now go, because if the government of any colour comes out of this now, whether at UK or Scottish level, and says that the only way we're going to get the economy to recover is to make government as small as possible and to go through a massive austerity programme, then they won't have learnt the lessons from 2010. And I think, it was music to most of our ears. I'm sure it was more music to Alistair Darling's ears than anybody else, when Rishi Sunak said in his budget, remember his budget he did in March, before the crisis currently kicked in, that government should use low borrowing to invest in the economy to increase the demand side, and so we can increase supply, so we can increase the economic growth and help wages. That's what we've been saying since 2008. I noticed the government have introduced a car scrappage scheme, which was done by the previous Labour government. So all of that stuff just shows that government can play a very, very positive role in getting the economy back on track. And if they can work in partnership with industries and sectors and trade unions and employers and employees of small businesses, then we can maybe get out of this a bit quicker.
I think that's a great point. And I think on the point about austerity, I see it every day, you'll see it every day. Our communities can't, go through another cycle of austerity, because all it will do is essentially compound the real challenges we've had through coronavirus. And what we need to do is kind of grow our way out of that and support our communities out of that, particularly in communities like Inverclyde, very, very high death rate in Inverclyde, very concerning. A lot of structural inequalities there that I think the Scottish Government need to really take action on. They have to have a commission, there's got to be an inquiry, we've got to drill down and understand what the issues are and how we solve it. And I suppose that maybe brings me to my next point about how do we learn lessons from the pandemic? You've been, I think, rightly critical of the Scottish Government's approach on things like testing, their attitude to care homes, the issues around the kind of the scandal with Nike and the Nike conference. I mean, what do you think we need to learn as a country about our response, and what do the government need to learn about their response?
Well, I mean, the first thing is, because the reason I've been raising all these issues about care homes and about the Nike conference and et cetera, is because it's about trust in government. You've got to be able to trust your government when things hit. And that's why we always said we would be a constructive opposition. You've got to be able to be in a position where you can say, you guys have the levers to do something about this, and we trust that you're going to pull those levers. Now, if things start to go wrong, what we've seen during this crisis, particularly in the Scottish Government perspective, and certainly with the UK government's perspective, is, sweep as much under the carpet as possible, put up the defences, and then say nothing and move and try and move on. That doesn't really help in these kind of situations, and it's been a real problem to try and get any kind of transparency about what decisions are being made. And I think there's a big underlying problem here, because the Edinburgh Evening News, the local newspaper in Edinburgh and the Lothians, published a list yesterday. I think it was 15 or 20 areas of Edinburgh and the Lothians where there has been 0 COVID deaths. Now, if you take care homes out, it wouldn't surprise you that there was a direct correlation between the most affluent areas and the fewer deaths. And that shows you that poverty is a big issue. It shows you that child poverty is a big issue. It shows you that black and ethnic minority poverty is a big issue. It shows you that pensioner poverty is a big issue. And these are the fundamental challenges that I hope that we address and we learn from as we come out of this. One of the big things, of course, this week, which I think is something that we haven't spoken about in Scotland for a long time, is educational inequality. And I think, given that the educational attainment gap will widen because of this, it will also be there will be a direct correlation between depravity and educational inequality. And these are the kinds of big issues that governments have got to grapple with, otherwise they will be irretrievable in a post-crisis like this.
We've got a couple of comments coming in on the live feed on Paul's Garden Gab. Folks saying they're enjoying the Garden Gab. I'm glad you're enjoying my garden. I was saying to Ian before we started that my partner Alan made sure we cut the hedge, because he said, you're not going on live on Facebook with a hedge too long. So that was all for you guys who are watching. Some really positive comments there about rebuilding and about the community effort. Someone's asked a question, Ian, about the Dominic Cummings debacle. So I don't know if you want to maybe just reflect on that and what that says about trust in government. I mean, I think that has eroded trust in the Tory government.
Well, look, let's be hugely political at the moment. I don't think anybody would be under any illusions that the Tory government have always had one rule for themselves and one for the vast majority of the general public. It's just a shame that that came to a head during a big crisis like this. And I just think, look, everyone's talked about whether or not it was legally right, whether it was against the rules, whether it was against the spirit of the rules. The bottom line here is that the person who actually wrote the rules and was asking everybody to abide by them has therefore then broken them. Now, that in itself is just the biggest problem here. And then for the thing that frustrated me more than anything else was the way that the entirety of the government machine trying to defend this person, rather than just facing it up, rather than just saying, we're sorry, he's sorry, we need this person, he's critical to government. It'd be much better if we apologised, we slapped him across the wrists, we told him not to do it again, and we moved on. But the very fact they tried to double down was extraordinary. And then you had the unsightly scene of Michael Gove running around TV studios the following day, saying that it was perfectly legitimate for him to drive a 60-mile round trip to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight because he was preparing for work. I mean, that's have I got news for you type comedy value. Absolutely. And that's what the problem is.
Natalie, who was on the Garden Gab the other night, is an optometrist. And I asked her, completely unrelated, of course, I said, should you get in your car to test your eyesight? And she said, optometrists would tell you absolutely not. You should go for an eye test. So it was just bizarre to watch.
The funny side to all that, if you can have a little bit of a light-hearted side to that, was because Douglas Ross, the junior Scotland Office Minister, resigned over it. And of course, he's also a Grade 1 assistant official, football official, sponsored by Specsavers. I couldn't help all this stuff on social media giving me a little bit of a giggle that the only person in government to resign over this is the person who's sponsored by Specsavers.
Oh, great. Well, Ian, we're just kind of going to begin to wrap up, but we did get a wee bit political there, which is okay, which is allowed on the Garden Gab at times. Someone's asked a question, Ian, about, I guess, the Labour Party and about our prospects, because you and I are both Labour politicians. We're facing a Scottish Parliament election next year. Who knows what that will look like, and indeed if it goes ahead as normal. But What's your sense about where we are, and how do we kind of refresh ourselves and maybe bring forward new ideas and new talent? I mean, that's kind of been asked by someone who's in the party on the Facebook live chat there.
Well, I mean, new talent into the party is one of the key challenges we're going to have to address. And I think every party has to go through a refresh. And I think it's long overdue in the Labour Party. And not by design, but by accident. You know, all of the big hitters from before, and, you know, we could reel off 20 names, probably were around so long, the generation behind them didn't exist. And I think that's been part of the problem. And the Labour Party's tried to reinvent itself at a time when politics, particularly in Scotland, is a bit paralysed by the Constitution. And that paralysis of the Constitution doesn't help the Labour Party, because it's something that never interested us. We were always interested in, and always continue to be interested in, poverty and inequality and helping communities and society and those kinds of issues. So I think the way in which the Labour Party refreshes itself is firstly to settle the big questions that people are talking about around the dinner tables. They're not talking about in the pubs at the moment, but they're talking about around the dinner tables. That's the question of the Constitution. I hope we've now settled that. The Scottish Executive Committee has been pretty clear now what our position has always been, but it's been re-emphasised. And if everyone sings from the same hymn sheet on that, I think that settles that position. And I think in a post-COVID Scotland, the Scottish Labour Party has to address the big issues that people are now wanting to be addressed. And if politics in Scotland continues to be paralysed and indeed, in my words, poisoned, and in my view, poisoned by the constitutional arguments, I think Scotland will suffer from that. And I think actually, when you look at some of the things like the worst economy in the world, you know, care home deaths being higher than most other places, excess deaths being one of the worst in the world, maybe we're suffering from the fact that over the last 10 or 15 years, our politics has been paralysed by the Constitution rather than dealing with some of these underlying systemic issues in our society. So I hope we can move on to saying what is important to Scottish people: public service, frontline workers, secure work, aspiration for young people, good education system. Well, let's come together to try and deliver some of that, or we can keep arguing about yes or no, and those inequalities will just widen. Our economy will worsen, and that will take Scotland backwards rather than forwards, in my view.
And just, I mean, I think you started to begin to sum some of that up. But you know, coming out of coronavirus, going into recovery, looking at the challenges, what are your kind of big takeaways? What do you want to see change in our country? I mean, all of the things we've talked about today, I think, are all really practical things, but as Shadow Scotland Secretary and as a key player in the Shadow Cabinet, you know, what's going to be your kind of agenda for change going forward?
Well, I mean, it's the big things. I mean, this isn't rocket science, Paul, and I think that's been something that maybe all political parties have lost, but particularly the Labour Party. Post-coronavirus, we know that the things that are important to people have been emphasised through this. You know, a health system that's well funded and there when you need it, the people who work in it well supported and well paid, an education system that gives every single pupil, from the most deprived to the richest areas, all the best opportunities in life that they can get, a jobs and career system that gives people progression and secure pay, so they can get their mortgages and look after their families and give their children the best start in life. These are very basic principles that I think we've always championed as a party, but it's something now I think we've got an opportunity to put into action. I think the vast majority of the public would be with us on that. And all of the inequalities in society, my goodness, have they not been highlighted over the last 6 months? The Black Lives Matter things in terms of our inherent inequalities with race, with gender, with sexuality, all of those big issues, inequalities in education, inequalities in health, inequalities in terms of age. These are all things I think we need to tackle, and we need to challenge, and we need to look to the future on those. I'm very excited about the fact that we might be coming to a situation where we can start talking about these things much more enthusiastically and having a proper national debate about them. Because I think if we're able to do that, politics will be looked upon of any party as being much more positive. And I think then that means we can deliver some positive change.
Absolutely. And I think through all my conversations with folk here locally, and through these garden gabs, I think that's what's coming across. People want to build that consensus. They want to rebuild, essentially, our country, and they want us to do that in a really forward-thinking and collaborative way. So, Ian, thank you very much for joining me on the Garden Gab today. I've been doing these for a couple of weeks now, and I really hope that local people and anyone who tunes in enjoys them. We're going to be continuing them with a variety of people, talking to some people who've been on the front line next week, and also thinking about some people who've been volunteering in other parts of the country as well. Obviously, the restrictions on kind of phasing out of lockdown changed yesterday. So, as always on a Friday, I just wish everyone who's watching a good weekend and ask you all to stick to the rules and behave yourself, so we can continue to make progress, which we all want to see. But thank you, as always, for tuning in. Ian, thanks for your time. I know you're a very busy man, and I really appreciate it.
And thanks, Talon, for cutting the hedge.
Not a problem. I will pass that on, definitely. So thank you, everyone. And until next time on the Garden Gab, cheers and see you later.